Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Linwood Stranecki, and I'll be serving as the moderator for breakout session 4C. Fentanyl changed everything, bridging the gap between 12-step and harm reduction. Our speaker this afternoon is Jess Tilley. Jess Tilley was introduced to harm reduction in 1996 and has dedicated her life to the movement. Her expertise in the field of harm reduction has garnered her an international reputation. In her more than 2 decades of work, she has been on the front lines of needle exchange and syringe access, and eventually became the overdose prevention coordinator and site manager of the Cambridge Needle Exchange at AIDS Action Coalition. She is the executive director of the New England Users Union with 8 chapters across 6 New England states, and is currently co-chair of the American Alliance of Drug User Unions. In both of these union organizations, she has implemented a feminist-driven team-based model of leadership, which she is based off of her work with Louise Vincent. She has occupied and explored many roles in typical nonprofit structures, and her passion remains frontline activism. Currently, she is working to discover and educate drug-using leaders in the disciplines of outreach, community building, advocacy for basic human rights, and the nuance of human connection. She calls her School of Harm Reduction HRH 413. Providing best practice trainings to service agencies in the true meaning of harm reduction. At present, she heads the New England User Union SCS Task Force. Last year, Louise and Jess created #Reframe the Blame, a campaign launched against induced homicide laws and the failed war on drugs. They are currently revising the campaign and hope to use it as a tool to stop bills such as death by distribution in North Carolina from passing and cause an untold number of preventable fatal overdoses from occurring. Jess?
Hi, everybody. I think you were done, Linwood, in introducing me. I first am going to apologize a little bit. I turned in a bio that was about 2 years old. So death by distribution did pass in North Carolina, unfortunately, and we are facing it in multiple states across the United States right now. And I did want to mention that one of my current projects is HRW, but that does tie into my talk today. So my apologies. My apologies also that my camera is off. I work at a low barrier drop-in center for people who use drugs and trade sex. And as we often do see, we had an overdose on site today, and crisis management team post-overdose is using my office right now to work with the individual, and I could not walk in and get my laptop. So everybody is being denied my wonderful little Victorian dress I wore today, and for that I'm very sorry. But I hope to keep everybody entertained, and not so much entertained, but like educated, and hopefully change some thought processes, and also help people understand who I am, why I do the work I do, and why I chose this topic to talk about. So, Kentucky has always been a place that I love. Spent a good deal of time in my teens down in Louisville, traveling through. Even at that point, when I was 19, I was working with people who use drugs. And I remember being in Kentucky and being, and this is no offense because it was nothing against like Department of Public Health. This was more just being out in the streets, but being absolutely horrified and realizing the privilege I had as a white, queer woman from the North who used drugs, because what I saw in Kentucky terrified me. I saw, and this is way before we're talking like, without giving my age away, 1997, seeing just vast amounts of unsheltered children, because they literally were children under the ages of 21 mostly, who had been kicked out either because of religious beliefs or against, weren't practicing the same religious beliefs as their parents, because they chose to use drugs, and predominantly because they identified as queer and were living on the streets and being essentially forced into trading sex and using drugs. So, I think when I first started to work and collaborate with different individuals from Kentucky, it really felt like I had come full circle, and I'll explain why when I tell you a little bit about my past. But that was my long introduction of saying I'm really honored to be here, and I was very thankful when I was asked to speak for this particular summit. So I don't know who is on listening. I'm going to assume a lot of people don't know who I am. I have been working, as you heard in my bio, that I should have made sure I gave you the right one. But I have been working in frontline service provision in harm reduction for 26 years now. I started when I was 19. I like to put this up front. One of the things I do identify as is a person who injects drugs, because as you hear my story, and again, why I chose this topic, I have spent a lot of time in abstinence-based recovery. And one of the things that kept me from entering abstinence-based recovery for years was feeling that I couldn't be on this pedestal, that the people that had what I wanted, because my path of recovery wasn't abstinence-based. And so I identify as a person who injects drugs because that's part of who I am. And you don't know if I used 10 minutes ago or 20 years ago. I will be honest and say that it is more closer to the latter because of the fact that fentanyl has infiltrated our drug stream, and it is a death sentence nowadays. To give you a tiny bit more history about me, the reason harm reduction is so important to me, and I don't know how many people are listening that, where you stand on the continuum of harm reduction. I like to say up front, harm reduction is not enablement. It's we enable people to live another day, and that abstinence is most definitely part of harm reduction. Abstinence to me is the most extreme form of harm reduction. For some people, harm reduction is just never using a drug or drink a day again in their life. And, I think that's really important to point out, because when I first came into harm reduction, I was at, I should put this up front. Trauma was my gateway drug. It wasn't marijuana. It wasn't alcohol. It was trauma. And I wasn't given the skills as a kid. I think, like so many of us who have lived experience or who have active addiction, wherever we are in a continuum of use, I didn't have the skill set to navigate the trauma that I experienced as a young child and continue to experience. And so by the time growing up very working class Irish family, it was like you just stuffed it down, you didn't talk about it, and you kept it moving. And this is not a stereotype. I don't mean it this way, but coming from first generation Irish, my family was all drinkers, and I knew that I didn't want to drink. And so at 15, I experienced horrendous, I'm going to say trigger warning, but like very bad sexual assault. And I was, a few weeks later, offered heroin, and I knew it was the first drug I ever tried. And I knew that when I had done it, it was the first time I felt like I could be present without having to be present. And I truly believe, and I've been totally ostracized after saying this at talks, so if anybody gets angry, please save it for afterwards. I truly believe heroin saved my life at that point, but in the end, it almost took my life. It wouldn't be for a few years that I would enter into my first harm reduction space, although I was introduced to activism through ACT UP, because my aunt was what we called at the time full-blown AIDS, and she was very involved in ACT UP. And so I'd heard about harm reduction, but I didn't know there were words for it. So she had brought me to my first rallies, and I remember thinking, this is my tribe. These are the people that I want to be around. This is what I want to do when I grow up. I'm still saying this is what I want to do when I grow up, but I'm 46 now. So, fast forward, I end up in full scholarship in one of the Seven Sisters schools to the Ivy League. I came from a family where nobody had graduated high school for the last 3 generations. And I was in a completely different class than I'd ever been in, and immediately felt that need to hide again, and to cover up who I really was. And again, like I said, I didn't have the tools to navigate, and was reintroduced to heroin and was off and running. This led to me being kicked out of school because, it wasn't swept under the rug. At Smith, they would sweep things under the rug and it wasn't talked about if you weren't, when you were what they call now a non-traditional student. So services were offered to me. However, they had a wonderful professor who told me about the syringe exchange program in town. And so it took me about 3 weeks to actually, gather the courage to go in. And when I did, and I'm sure if there are people who've heard my story, they've heard this, and I've said it 1,000 times and I'll say it again, because if you are somebody who provides services, you need to know this. What was given to me that day when I walked in was saved my life. It absolutely saved my life. And I would not be here 26 years later as an individual who has started multiple programs across the United States, who writes grants, who oversees, right now with HRH 413, oversees outreach teams that help individuals like myself, younger, who cannot or will not access brick and mortar. Often people who use drugs and trade sex, we are, I hate to say the word lie, but we are taught to lie in order to be able to procure services that any individual should have without question, being food, housing, love, respect, and literally being treated like a human. And I had been trying to garner those things because by this point I was living on the streets. I hadn't showered in about 2 weeks, and I did not feel like I was worthy of anybody's love, including my own. I couldn't even look at myself in a mirror anymore. And it wasn't the drug use, because media teaches us that drugs make us hate ourselves. It was the way society reflected my image back. I knew I was a good person. I knew I was a very good person. But I was being told because I did drugs, I was less than human and I did not deserve love, respect. And in fact, I should be treated like essentially an outcast of society. And so when I walked into the exchange that day, I had my story ready that, I've been clean and sober for 30 days, which was absolutely untrue. And that I was getting syringes for a friend, and the individual who was there, who later became somebody very instrumental in harm reduction and the field of harm reduction and in my life, said, you don't have to do that here. You don't have to lie. Like, we love you the way you are. Like, we love you. And 2 things happened that day. I realized that nobody had looked me in the eye and treated me with dignity and love, respect, or just looked me in the eye. And it felt humanizing. It felt amazing. It felt better than any drug. And the second thing they did was they planted the seed in me that this was the hill that I wanted to live and die upon. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but I knew that what had been given to me so freely and without judgment and radical love and compassion, that I needed to be able to give this back someday, because I was at death's door. And that day I walked out and I said, I don't know what I was just given, but I want to come back and get it again the next day. I say this because this figures into my story later with 12-step. And so I came back and I kept coming back. I was making up excuses to come back. I was like, I need a toothbrush. And the other thing is they hugged me. Like, the power of human touch when given with consent is beyond any drug. And it wasn't done because they felt they had to do it. it was done because it's what was done to the people that work there because they had lived experience. And so I say this as like two service providers. This is why we need to have people with lived experience working in our programs. Because I honestly believe had there not been at least one person with lived experience, I might not have had that experience that day. And so it kept me coming back. And people who are familiar with 12 step are going to recognize that phrase because I'm trying to lay the platform of why we need to close this gap. What did happen is they ended up offering me work. It started off very small, like 2 hours a week and 4 hours a week. And then within, I would like to tell you that I sobered up after those first 2 weeks, but that's not my story of recovery. And I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. But what did happen that day is that I realized there was a different way. And I realized that I was worthy of life and that nobody was ever again going to tell me that I was a bad person because I used drugs. So, the flip side to that, and I think this is really important to talk about, and it wasn't talked about when I came into harm reduction in 1996. It was a very, very small community of us. It was nothing like we see nowadays. We were like I try to use a different term. I used to say bastard children, but that's pretty offensive. We were like the unwanted Department of Public Health. They kind of the unwanted component of public health. We were not invited to meetings. We were not included in state conversations. Although I have to say here in Massachusetts, we were considered at that, and still a model for how harm reduction programs were run. But, if you look nationally, it was not embraced the way it is now. The fact that now SAMHSA is allowed to say things like harm reduction. CDC is giving money to harm reduction programs. I never thought I'd live to see that day. But, what eventually came in my life in harm reduction was a point where it was time for me to stop. And that's why I stress so hard that syringe exchange programs, I believe it's 15% of what we do is exchange a syringe. And when you exchange a syringe, people aren't welcoming you with open arms, "Whoa, thank you. I'm so happy you're giving me a syringe." They're usually looking at you with apprehension, distrust, because this is not something that is done normally by the time somebody gets to one of our programs. But what it is, it's an opening for engagement for people to develop trust with us. I often say, we are conduits. We are not, I get told all the time, "You're doing God's work, you're a hero, you're an angel." No, I'm not. I'm just another human who has been through, some pretty horrendous stuff because of not because of drug use. Although I will say drug use does get ugly, it gets chaotic, but more so because of the way I was treated because I was a person who uses drugs. And what I am is I'm a conduit for the radical love that was so freely given me. And that's what I will continue to be until the day I die. However, because I was in harm reduction, and again, I've given this talk and I gave it recently, and somebody came to me afterwards and said, "I thought you were going to get up there and bash on 12 step, and I was all ready to be angry at you, and you were going to put harm reduction above it." And I was like, no, I want to talk about the fact that when I came in the 90s, people, a lot of the people who laid the groundwork for harm reduction had been incredibly hurt by 12 step. And it wasn't the program, it was the people. I like to compare it to the Catholic Church because I came from the Catholic Church. I am very much a spiritual person. However, the church hurt me. It wasn't the religion, it was the people involved that hurt me. But that being said, there's a great book, if anybody's read it yet. Maya Salovitz, who's a wonderful woman, wrote a book about the history of Undoing Drugs, and I forget the second part. It's like the untold history of drugs in America. I probably, sorry, Maya, if you're out there and heard me, I just totally bashed it. But there's a story of one of my colleagues in there, and it's my story too. So by the time I was 22, I was like already being internationally recognized as a drug user organizer. And I'm not going to get into talking about what a drug user union is today, but I will say that it is not about advocating for the right to use drugs. It's advocating for people who use drugs, past and present, to have basic human rights like housing, and to fight against just the classist, racist, just vicious judicial system we have in incarceration, and especially amongst the most marginalized and vulnerable, being BIPOC, Black and Brown people who use drugs. So that's about 85% of the members of any UU. And I will say that over half of our members are in abstinence-based recovery, but are still dealing with the repercussions of drug use. And so I was starting to do drug user organizing at this time, and I realized that I was done using. And because harm reduction had kind of built its own camp, I was just 22, and I felt somehow I had built up this belief in myself that if I stopped using drugs, I wasn't worthy of being a harm reductionist. And I hear people constantly talk in the field about imposter syndrome because they don't use drugs and they want to work in harm reduction. And I'm here to say that some of the best harm reductionists I know have never even smoked a cigarette. And some of the best harm reductionists I know are still actively using drugs. It's not about what you're putting into your body or not putting into your body. It's about who you are, what your heart is, and how well you check your judgment at the door. That being said, 24 years ago, I didn't understand that yet. And I felt that if I sought help to get abstinent, that somehow I was betraying the community that I love so much. And I didn't talk about it because I felt like I would somehow lose my cred. And we didn't have the term imposter syndrome back then, but I felt like if I went to a meeting, somehow I was going to be kicked out of the community that had loved me back to life. And that's ridiculous because I experienced that also in 12-step when I decided that I was going to pick up again, and not even pick up my drug of choice. I had just reached a point where I felt that I was ready. And when I say that, I felt because somebody always I literally had someone walk up to the stage as I was talking, and I was like, please don't hit me. But what I say, I want to give this disclaimer that this is my path of recovery. I do not advocate it for anybody else because I've seen people do it and die. So when I came into 12-step, I came in feeling like I had to hide it from the harm reduction community. And what came out of that was about 5 years of my life where I left a community that I loved. I built a gap that I saw grow exponentially over the years with other people. And I had one foot in one world and one in the other. And I was at a conference talking to people like myself who were absent, who worked in harm reduction. And I started to realize that there were many people who felt this way. And this was still going back 20 something years ago, and that we needed to talk about it because what was happening, and this is back, we had fentanyl back in the day, but we called it P-dope, and very small pockets, wasn't killing people. You could identify, knew what it was, you didn't use it. What was happening though is that people fell in that gap and they disappeared. And I don't mean they necessarily died. They lost both communities because they couldn't be their authentic selves in 12-step. And then they felt like they didn't belong in the harm reduction world anymore. And I saw some amazing, amazing harm reductionists who are luckily still alive today leave, who could have stayed again, because abstinence, again, I will say it over and over, is part of harm reduction. So, fast forward years later, sorry, I always do really long introductions. I can say it was 2014. Those of us who, actually, I'll back it up a little bit because I was in 12 step, and I think this is important to say. I'm a person who is on an MOUD and methadone, and I will probably be on methadone until the day I die. I'm also epileptic. I don't look at my methadone as any different than the Dilantin I take. Um, I think it's media again, and unfortunately, some of the abstinence-based community that will do things like say that this is a drug, that it is not a drug, it's a medication that makes people high, when used properly, when used between my doctor and myself, the way it's prescribed, it is no different. And I say this because while I was in 12 step, 6 days short of 7 years, I outed myself as being on methadone because I was watching people be run out of the rooms for talking about being on this new drug, Suboxone. It wasn't new; it had been around, but it was starting to be available to more of the larger society. Like larger. It was just more prevalent. And what scared me was one night I watched a young kid talk about, and anyone who's familiar with 12 step, we have specific meetings, and this happened to be a speaker meeting. And this kid was visibly in withdrawal, and he raised his hand and he said, in the middle of the speaker, and he said, I have a question. I need to know. He's like, I just got out of detox an hour ago and I don't want to use. How do I do what you're doing? And the speaker said, well, I can tell you the first thing, it's not going to be Suboxone or methadone. And also, we have what's called a burning desire, and you can wait until the end to speak. And the kid's face turned bright red and he walked out, and nobody followed him. I got up to start to follow him. They said, men stick with the men, women stick with the women, which was like really, really offended me, especially as a queer woman. And I sat down and I said, this is not a community I want to be part of anymore. And I stood up during the burning desire and I said, I'm on methadone. And suddenly I wasn't allowed to be part of the area. And this is not about bashing 12 step in any way. It's just a lot of people's experience. There were rumors instantly about me nodding out, about me being in the bathroom, about me selling drugs in the bathroom. I had 7 sponsees and they were told that they could no longer be considered sober if I was sponsoring them. And so I chose to leave. And by leaving, it almost killed me. Now, I picked up, and I'm going to say it wasn't because of that situation. I had been contemplating use. I didn't return to my drug of choice, but thank God, or goddess, whatever anyone's belief is, that I had enough harm reduction support that I could talk to people and say that this is what I'm going to do. And I have a plan, and can people sit with me and be safe? Because I could have easily died. And thankfully it was before fentanyl hit our supply. From that day on, I started to talk about the gap between both sides, and it shouldn't be sides. It shouldn't be harm reduction in 12 step. We should be one whole community. And this is where I'm going to fast forward to 2014. We start seeing fentanyl deaths in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. In here, I was in Massachusetts. I was also the second person in the United States, second or third, to start implementing fentanyl test strips. And I was told by the Department of Public Health that there was no fentanyl in our area. What I knew is that 7 of my friends had died within 2 months, and they were well-seasoned injection drug users who knew their supply, who thought they knew their supply, and they were now dead. And by doing something as simple as, I knew somebody who was using fentanyl test strips, who had a friend who was using them in Vancouver. We were able to tangibly show that there was fentanyl in the supply, and still it was like talking, like shouting into the wind. That's another, sorry, I'm going to get off my soapbox because I'm still pretty angry about that, because now we have them in Massachusetts. And I wonder how many lives could have been saved if the Department of Public Health would listen to people who are on the ground, listen to people who actively use drugs, because we know our community and we know when things are awry. And if we remember, that's how harm reduction started, when the Department of Public Health had no idea why patients, hemophiliacs, I'm saying this word, please nobody yell at me again, identifying as queer, homosexuals. It was the 4-H club. And what I missed, patients, hemophiliacs, homosexuals, and there was one more. I'm going to feel silly when it doesn't come to me, but that was the whole reason that harm reduction was created, because, Department of Public Health, all of these experts came to the communities and said, how do you keep yourself safe? Again, a common misconception is people who use drugs do not care about themselves, do not care about their community. I can tell you, after working in this field and being somebody in the community, nothing could be further from the truth. So as fentanyl was hitting, it almost seemed like the gap got bigger, because as harm reductionists started talking about implementing, and again, it was not a means to an end, talking about safe consumption spaces, talking about drug checking, talking about fentanyl test strips, really flooding the community with naloxone. What was coming out of the abstinence-based community was that's enablement. I mean, like, I hate that word. That's why you heard me say at the very beginning. The only thing we do to enable is we enable people to live another day to find their path of recovery. And now I'm careful when I say multiple paths of recovery, because I said this recently. I was like, if somebody was to come to me and tell me that the way I define harm reduction is absolutely wrong, and I need to define it a different way, and I need to call it something different, I probably wouldn't respond so well. So when we talk to people who are in abstinence-based recovery and tell them there's multiple paths of recovery and one size doesn't fit all, this medical model that people in this moral model people have been using for so long is wrong. It's not that it's wrong. It's just one type. And so, when fentanyl entered the picture, it wasn't just about chaotic drug users. And I hate the term chaotic, but when we look at the continuum of drug use, only 10% of people will be what we call chaotic, long-time, lifelong drug users. Most people will outgrow even using drugs like cocaine, heroin, or they will find MOUD. But what I started to see was absolute decimation of a full generation of kids. And by kids, I mean like 30 and under. A friend of mine was recently at one of the largest NA conventions in the United States, and he said what really frightened him is that it seemed like there was nobody under the age of 50 there. And what that means to me is that gap has gotten so big that people aren't even getting the chance to get into recovery. They're not even getting a chance to get to the rooms, because we have a supply that is so poisoned that there isn't that chance to even get to the chaotic state that where you want a different way of life. For those lucky enough to get in, as we know, recovery is not, like, for the lucky few that first time in, stayed sober, like, more power to you. I love that. I love hearing that story. But for most of us, it is, and it's like a 1 foot in, 1 foot out, in and out, reoccurrence is part of recovery. 10 years ago, when somebody would leave abstinence-based recovery, they would pick up, they would use, they would usually come back, full of internalized shame, stigma, remorse, but a hopefulness to get back onto the path they had chosen. They would get a chip, they would get a coin, and, with hopefully, within a good community, they would be embraced and be uplifted. What's happening now is when somebody goes out, they die. And That sounds so like across the board final, but it's what we are seeing. Recently speaking to a group of absence-based individuals, very large group, I asked how many people in the room have lost somebody in the program in the last year. Every hand went up. And so that means, and that's a small place in New Hampshire, a big room of people, but that's happening across the United States. And when I think about the individuals I lost in my life up until 2014, 2015 to opiate overdose, I could count literally on one hand. I'm well over 130, I think, the last time I wrote down, and that was last year. And that's not counting the harm reductionists, the well-known harm reductionists that we've lost. And so if we're losing people in harm reduction who can't talk about their own drug use, then when they're embraced and surrounded with people who say they understand people who use drugs, can you just imagine what it would be like to be in a room full of people who are telling you drug use is bad? I worry about recovery coaches and peer support specialists, because I've seen in the past year and a half, we've lost 9 in my area because they had no one to turn to when they picked up again, because it would mean losing the stability of a job, losing your cred, losing your credentials. And so this is why we have to close this gap. We are of the same camp. We just have different models of approach. We want the same outcome. We want people to live their best life, to be healthy, to be happy, and to stay alive. Like I said, again, the pushback doesn't just come from 12-step against harm reduction. There is a mindset sometimes in harm reduction, again, like I was saying, with even myself included, that if you are going, quote unquote, to the other camp, then you somehow aren't practicing harm reduction. 12-step is harm reduction as well. 12-step is a set of practices and principles that help us lead a better life. And however we choose to lead that better life, that's on us. And as people who work with people who are making these choices, whether it be your pre-contemplation, contemplation, picking up, our job as service providers, because I think, did I mention I'm very much a service provider? I've been on both sides of the desk, is to help nurture and guide and support effort for effort those decisions. And if that decision is to still use on a daily basis, then there is no need to create this gap in service provision. While we do at that point, again, why I mentioned conduit is to be the conduit to help that person so that they don't fall into that gap. All of this pushback, and I hate going on social media and I spoke at Mobilize Recovery, and for those, I was going to say, for those who aren't familiar, Google it, and with Ryan Hampton. And I honestly thought I would get run out of the room. And I think this story is important because, Ryan had asked me to speak, and I put together this wonderful slideshow that I was actually going to use today. But when I looked at the slideshow again, it's not my true narrative. It's the narrative that I thought the people in the room would want to hear. And it's the narrative that I thought people today would want to hear. And I think I might be a little bit more brutally honest today because we just lost my mentor and my colleague, one of my best friends, Mark Kinsley, who was like instrumental in starting harm reduction and programs in this country. And what broke my heart is he is somebody who had been bounced back from harm reduction to 12-step to 12-step to harm reduction. And even though his death had nothing to do with substances, both sides still said, oh, well, we saw this coming. Of course, it was going to be an overdose, and it wasn't. And, it made me want to be brutally honest. Like, we can't keep doing this to people. People use drugs for various reasons. People use drugs because it makes them feel better. People use drugs because of trauma. People use drugs to survive. And when they stop using drugs, the community that they are going to enter has to understand that they may pick up again. And if they pick up again, they need to be there to support them, not to say, I saw this coming a mile away. And the harm reduction side needs to know that, yes, sometimes people who are the largest, most dedicated drug user activists come to a point when they say, I'm done. And even New England Users Union, our biggest, like what we're pushing on our campaigns right now, are advocating for people who still want to actively use to get onto methadone, to get onto Suboxone. And I don't ever want to see one of those people, because they're making a life-saving decision to get on a medication and need more support, enter into 12-step and be told that they are not sober, because they are damn well sober. If you're able to get up, take your medication, go to work, I don't care if you're able to get up, go to work and be on drugs. If you're able to live your life the way you want to live it, and you're not hurting yourself, you're not hurting others, then that's your path of recovery. And it doesn't make you better or worse than the person that has 27 years sober. It just makes your story different. This is not a one size fits all narrative. This is not a one size fits all recovery way of life. And by fighting one another so much, the amount of people that have fallen into that gap, now that fentanyl is here, is terrifying. And I don't see any easy way, I don't want to say easy way out, or any, any magical cure happening, but we do have things. We do have tools that will make it easier, and yet we have such pushback, like absolutely like, shaming and saying that's insane. Why would we let somebody use in a safe consumption space? Why don't I just put them in a bar and let the bartender keep serving them? No, it's not. If I hear that comparison one more time, I'm going to claw my eyes out. And trust me, I'm already blind enough. Like, me without eyes would just be a mess. Like, being someone who has worked in underground safe consumption spaces, again, like I said about syringe exchange, what happens in those spaces, like the actual using of the drug, and now that we have mass spectrometers, we can check the supply, another amazing tool in this country, to be able to say in real time this, and I hate it when I hear back, oh, nobody's going to take 5 minutes to test their drugs. Well, guess what they are, because I've seen it happen, because nobody wants to die. And so, yes, they're going to take the 5 minutes to check. And when somebody has a tangible evidence in their hand, when they swore up and down that their drugs did not have fentanyl in it, they do implement drug change, or what we call like, trends in drug use. And so what happens in the space, when we're in a space where somebody can use safely with medical supervision or peer supervision, is that nobody has ever died. Nobody has died in one of these spaces. But what has happened is people have said, you know what, I'm tired. I'm tired. I experienced a sexual assault last night. I was kicked out of my home. I'm done. And can you help me get to the next step? And that's where we have a place to say, yes, we can. And without those spaces, we don't have that. So we have people dying in alleyways. And, I used to say that's just media. People don't die with a syringe in their arm. With fentanyl on the landscape, they do now. I've seen overdoses that look like they're straight out of like Train Spotting. And I never thought I'd see something like that. And I don't want to see it. And I don't want, one of the things I do on a daily basis and is work with parents. And I don't want to have to tell another parent that there was a way that their child could have been saved. But unfortunately, we live in a country where, we have so many rules based on moral values. And our drug laws were created to literally like hurt people. And I feel like if we, and I say we because I have a foot in both camps, if we could stop fighting one another, if we could stop saying your way is wrong, your way is wrong. I said to somebody in NA, I said, your program thrives on actively using people. That's the newcomer. And if the newcomer is the most important person, and it always was for me, then why aren't you welcoming them and making this a safer place for them to be? And same going back into the harm addiction community, which I think, both, I do want to say this because I sound like very, very harsh. Both communities have become much more embracing. I give 12 Step so much credit because I have seen such a shift in the way that people look at what recovery is. And although I feel like every time I say that, I go to a meeting and I hear something horrific and I hear about another person being run out of the rooms. But I feel that this fentanyl, I don't call it an epidemic because an epidemic usually ends. I call it an apocalypse. When we reached a place where we've lost more people than we lost at the height of the AIDS epidemic, I came into harm reduction at the end of, not the end of the AIDS epidemic, where things were starting to get a little bit better and people weren't dying every day. And I talked to my mentors who lived through that, who worked in harm reduction, when harm reduction didn't even have a name yet. And we're going to funerals daily. They never thought they would see this again. I was so thankful I'd never seen it. And now I'm living in it, and it's hell. And I know probably everybody listening to me is living through it in some way. The amount of parents I work with that say to me that they were told that if their child got onto methadone, got onto Suboxone, got onto Vivitrol, that their child would not be quote unquote clean and sober. So they kept their child from getting these drastically needed harm reduction services. And now their child is buried. They use their child's college fund to bury their child. I don't want to have those conversations with parents anymore. I want to say there is a different way and that your child can stay alive and be on this substance and it's harm reduction, and they can still be considered in abstinence-based recovery. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You don't have to practice tough love. Tough love is probably the biggest reason we have this gap. And the fear, I know when I was in 12 step, the fear that I had of going out and losing my community, but not being able to be honest with my community, again, almost killed me. And I've heard that story time and time and time again from people in 12 step. We have to learn to work together. We have to be able to do, and I'm talking about service providers who are abstinence-based as well. We have to learn to be able to do warm handoffs and to check our judgment at the door and think about what's best for the people we serve and what's going to allow them to be their best selves. I hate that term. I always say I'm not going to say my best life or best self. So excuse me for it just coming up. And I believe I wanted to leave room for questions, but I wanted to end with something that should have been in my biography. One of the things over the years as being a service provider and as a person who was seeking services that wasn't available was a mutual aid self-help group. We had Smart Recovery, there were a few things that pop up now and then. And, there were some phenomenal groups that were being run. I give credit. Sorry, Linwood, I didn't hear you.
No, I think that's on my end. So we do have a few questions in the chat if you're ready for them.
Yeah, I was just going to close up with HRW. Check out harmreductionworks.org, or harmreduction.works. There's a great group that I co-wrote, and it's their online meetings internationally now. Never thought that would happen, but there's a group for parents and loved ones of people who are using drugs. That's phenomenal. So I can always send information about that, but yeah, go for the questions.
Okay. So Emily King has two questions. Her first is, she says, I have fentanyl test strips always available for people, but it seems folks push back from time to time, stating that they know what they're using since they've had the same dealer for years. What are some of the key points or particular catchphrases or suggestions for getting people to recognize and utilize the test strips?
I love this question. I dealt with the same thing when I first started, and part of it was people who said, we know our drugs have fentanyl and we don't need to test it. However, when we started talking about different analogs and also the other cut, there's something that happens. I know I said it earlier, when people see a tangible result, that seems to kind of change the way. And they use, are people saying that they know their drugs don't have fentanyl? They know their supply? Is that the pushback?
Yes, she's saying folks are pushed back from time to time, stating that they know what they're using since they've had the same dealer for years.
Okay, so I'll give you a quick story to tell and say that because I work with people who sell drugs, the people who sell drugs, right, and I'm working on not low level, mid level, and upper level, swear they don't have fentanyl. And when we test it, they realize there's fentanyl. I've seen supply pulled off the street because of it. And this was early on before we're seeing it. Very quickly, I had somebody who I've been working with for years, who had been incarcerated for 9 months. The day he got out, he told me, I'm going to use, I've been waiting for 9 months. He came to me to get supplies. I just gotten fentanyl test strips. I said, I want you to test your drugs. And he said that exactly. I've been seeing my dealer for 12 years. He doesn't have fentanyl. And fentanyl had been around for a little bit at this point. And I said, please, can you just do it for me? He calls me 20 minutes later. He sends me a screenshot and he said, what does this mean? I said, it means it's positive for fentanyl. And he was alone. And I said, well, what do I do? He goes, I'm definitely doing it. I just bought it. And that's a lot of times people, they have no choice. They're going to do it regardless. I asked him, I'd given him naloxone. I said, please find somebody to use with. He did. He called me the next day. He had actually gone out halfway through with the syringe in his arm. And he said, because of this test strip, I'm alive today. He goes, my mother would have came home and found me dead in the bathroom. And he had sworn, he argued with me about 15 minutes saying there's no fentanyl in this. And because, and ironically, it was cocaine. So he was saying there's no fentanyl in the cocaine. And we are seeing more and more. What I would tell people that story, and it's because it's not just my story. I've heard this over and over and over from different providers around the country. The other thing you can tell people if they do find it is give them the tips like I just said, have somebody with naloxone, go slow, use a tourniquet, dilute it. We can talk, I can give you my email, we can talk about dilution and other ways too, but that's a great question. I'm just bossy. I'm a bossy harm reductionist when people push back, and I'm also older. So I'm like, look, don't make me be your mom while you're taking this test strip. And also really sometimes just showing somebody how to use the test strip because it seems really complicated. And when they see that it only takes like 2 seconds, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll use it. So I got the same pushback for a while too.
Her second question is, there are now medication-assisted recovery anonymous meetings in my city, but the bad taste of AA or NA has left a hurdle in discussions for people about seeking a self-help group in addition to our MOUD. Do you have any key points to address that might help someone grow into their willingness to try it?
Yes, definitely. And that's why I'm so mad at myself for not looking at the time because I really wanted to talk about harm reduction works. When we started it, again, I really highly encourage people to look at the script because it's a fully scripted meeting. And I've got a lot of, almost weekly get emails from people who are trying to start either MOUD or, different types of harm reduction groups. You will hear that when the group starts. It's about getting people in the room. And the way to do that a lot of times is to get a guest speaker, somebody like, I'm not saying like myself, but somebody who has this message to kind of like dispel that. What we experienced when we first started having our meetings before COVID, because they were in person, and now there's like 3 or 4 meetings every night online, different specialty groups, but people they have that trauma. They want to talk about what happened in 12-step. What we did is we allowed that talk to happen, but we also talked about what I was been talking about the last hour. Like, look, this happens in harm reduction. This happens in 12-step. This is about how do we create something new where this is a safe place to talk. Because what I hear what happens in MOUD groups is it's fine to talk about being on methadone, but what about if you're deciding to pick up? Because then there comes this part where usually a facilitator will be like, well, you can't do that, you're not sober. And so it's about having expanding the MOUD or that place to also include talking about harm reduction, talking about like coping mechanisms and why we pick up, and even just talking chemistry wise, what it means to have Subox in your system and how it affects how methadone can work as an antidepressant, and why are you like, what are the reasons that we're still choosing to use drugs when we have either a partial opiate agonist versus a full opiate agonist in our body. So there again, you can totally have me. I would love to have that conversation in a much longer, bigger explanation rather than I have 5 minutes left.
Okay. John Bingham is asking, I'm curious as to the speaker's thoughts on the legalization and regulation of sex work.
So, I could get a whole talk about that. So, anybody who's familiar with FOSTA SESTA being passed, which was supposed to protect sex workers, it was about shutting down online sex work platforms. And I believe most of this was done with good intentions. What it did was we ended up within the first month and a half, I can tell you state by state how many sex workers died, disappeared, were trafficked because they could no longer screen potential clients. I absolutely fully support the legalization. What I should say is I absolutely support ending the prohibition against sex work and legalizing, but also having really, I don't want to say not laws at all, but having input not from lawmakers, not from politicians, not from people who feel they're rescuing women, men, I say women because I work mostly with trans women who are engaged in trading sex. Not coming from a place of the protector, but really including the voices of individuals who trade sex in creating a system that is going to keep themselves safe as well as the clients they serve. So I am very pro. I've gotten ripped down for saying this. I am not somebody who denies that trafficking happens in this country, and it happens everywhere, but definitely happens in this country. I also believe trafficking happens because of prohibition and because sex work has been so demonized and made illegal. So that is my view on it. I'm also very much do not believe law enforcement has any place in saying they're doing trafficking work or anti-trafficking work, because I've seen so much damage done when an individual is told, we will let you keep your house, your kids, your freedom if you tell us you have a pimp. And that is not everybody's story. And given that option, many women will unfortunately place themselves at the mercy of the legal system. And I've never heard a case where somebody walked out keeping their kids, keeping their home, keeping their sanity and safety. Sorry, stepping off my soapbox. That was a good question.
So that's all the questions in the chat, unless Dylan, did you have any more on your end?
Nope, I just sent them to you.
So Jess, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. When Drew asked me to help with speakers, you were at the top of my list of folks to get. I know you've been an inspiration to me, and I know a lot of other folks. So I also want to thank all of our participants. We have a break now until 2:30, and then we'll have our closing keynote. Thank you all very much.